Campers, what is the scariest, creepiest, or most disturbing thing that has happened to you in the woods? Story 1. When I was younger, my family used to camp at a state park, and every night my friend and I would walk through the woods. We called this the ritual. But this particular night, we decided to walk further into the woods than usual. We had flashlights because we liked trying to navigate through the woods with them turned off. We were about half a mile from the nearest campsite when we heard soft whispering behind us. We hit the flashlights and spun around. You didn't see anything. So we kept walking and we heard it again. This time, we stopped and looked around a bit before heading back to our campsite. Then we saw what was whispering. It's a lady crawling on the ground, whispering just random words. She was wearing dark clothes and was covered in dirt. When we noticed her, she stands up and declares that she is looking for her campsite. We ended up walking her back to the campground and trying to help her find her group. It turns out she was just super buzzed and got lost trying to find a bathroom. Her friends didn't even notice she was missing, and if we hadn't gone that far into the woods, she would have been lost all night. It was pretty creepy. Now, if there was ever a sequel to the Blair Witch Project, you guys remember that? This story could be the opening sequence to the film. Story 2. The scariest was camping with my wife when a windstorm blew up. I'm talking about trees being blown over, branches falling, and all of that in a forest full of jack pine. The creepiest was camping with my best friend. We were in a semi-remote camping area, drivable usually to get to it, but only with a 4x4. It was a semi-maintained camping area as there were a couple of fire pits, a few rotten picnic tables, and a rundown outhouse. Parks check out this place once a year or so. So we get there and we start setting up when my buddy wanders over to the toilet and opens the door. He stands there for a second or two and then closes the door and goes to the second one, goes in and comes out a few minutes later. He comes back to me and says, "Go check out that first one." I assume someone left some turd on the floor or an animal got stuck in there and perished or something. Nope, there were 3 full backpacks, and I am talking big bags. Like the bag I have in that size, which I use for week-long trips. So we get nosy and open them up. 2 are full of good quality gear, nothing unusual. The third is full of Skittles, bulk bags, small bags, regular, tropical, sour, every flavor and size of bag of Skittles you can imagine, just full of Skittles. We camped for 4 days but never saw a soul. The bags were still there when we left. We let the COs know when we got to civilization. So who left all that gear? Why did one person pack 80 liters of Skittles? We don't know, but it was super weird. Oh, another scary one. My dog and I were backpacking. It was a spur-of-the-moment overnight trip. It wasn't far off the road or anything, so I just had a tarp up as a small shelter. Small little fire. I wasn't hiding per se, but it wasn't obvious. I was just dozing off when I heard a truck rip up and a bunch of drunken voices. Then the started. Now, they probably didn't know I was there. I was parked on a different road and hadn't realized I had walked as close as I had to the second one. But I still don't like being in the area when a bunch of drunken yahoos are off weapons, especially when I was fairly certain they were in my direction, based on the lay of the land. So I put the pupper on a tight leash and I headed out ASAP. Story 3. Not exactly camping, but kinda. I lived in a very small town once when I worked from my laptop, like a population of 200 small. I was in a small cabin in the woods, though, next to the highway. One day I was walking my dog and I hear 2 gunshots somewhere nearby. I didn't think much of it. It's a hunting area and it's kind of redneck-like. The next day, or the day after, a truck pulls up. I don't even know anyone in this town, so it's weird and I'm put off. The guy calls me over and says he's my neighbor. He asks if I heard the shots. I said, yeah. He claims it was his neighbor taking pot shots at his house over a land dispute. He doesn't ask me to be a witness for him or anything, just if I heard. Okay, seems odd enough to me. I've never met this guy before, and when I say neighbor, I mean 500 meters to like 1 kilometer away out of sight. The guy sees my dog digging somewhere unimportant, and all of a sudden, he starts trying to tell her not to do that. She gets out, and she's iffy about him. He says, "Here, watch," and calls her over, grabs her, and tries to do the stupid Cesar Chavez dominance, holding the dog on their backs for no reason. She starts yelping, and I'm like, dude, stop. He asks me whether I have any weapons myself, and I say no. He says he's a great dog trainer. He asks me to go over and mow his lawn and says, "Please ensure to bring your dog," in the strangest way, just like that. I can't describe it, but his mannerisms and the way he talked were just plain creepy, especially that line. He leaves soon after, and I'm thinking, damn, I just told this guy not only that I heard the gunshots, but that I'm unarmed here. How do I even know it was his neighbor like he claimed, and not in fact that this weird dude has someone at his home and is trying to see who might have heard or witnessed? I wouldn't go to his house, not one chance in hell. I have a horrible feeling about it too. Then he kept showing up, asking why. He was also calling and texting, asking why. I gave him my number before realizing how weird he was. He was adamant that I go over there. It turns out the guy is a total alkie, lost his wife, his job, everything. A very dangerous mental state to be in, and there's nothing to lose. The small store owners in town explained the guy to me. He's the most hated guy in the valley. He has a bad reputation, and now I'm really freaking out. I found it very hard to sleep after that. Cabin in the woods, nobody nearby that would hear any commotion, ample angles for the place to be approached from the woods, and just a can of bear spray and a bladed weapon. And the guy knows I have no weapons. So one night, in the middle of the night, my dog started to growl. Then she growls some more. I didn't hear anything, but it didn't matter. Every room in that cabin had a window except the bathroom. I just got up, grabbed the blade and bear spray, and locked myself in that bathroom for hours, listening. I think I eventually fell asleep in there. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of dread, though. I just pictured this lunatic sneaking up with a weapon to take me out, having heard him do away with someone with a gun days earlier. It was just awful. I moved, but unfortunately the new landlords were equally creepy and even started trying to steal my dog even though they had 3. Like literally, I heard them discussing how they had to make themselves the in crowd so that she'd want to be with them and hand-feeding her dog food when they thought I wasn't looking. It must have been the small town thing. There were really strange people in that town for the most part. They went to the market one morning. I packed all my stuff into my uninsured van with no license and my pup, bailed out of town and never looked back. Good God, it was Hills Have Eyes kind of scary, I'm telling you. Story 4. So we went on a group camping trip in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, only to awaken and hear something sniffing the outside of our tent. Now my immediate reaction was that it was likely a bear or some animal that came across our sight, and just maybe my dumb friends didn't tie up the garbage. Seconds later, I can hear the sniffling go to the tent next to ours, and everyone in mine grabs one another quietly to acknowledge we are all awake and aware of what's happening outside. Moments later, a friend in another tent popped out and started to scream and make noise. He had a gun too, hoping it would scare off whatever animal was at our sight. It turns out it wasn't an animal. It was just some guy who had gone through our coolers and food and also decided it'd be okay to sniff our tents. Our friend chased him off and we immediately packed our stuff and left. A year after the incident, my friends and I went back to the nearby area thinking what we encountered was a one-time incident. This time, we thought we'd outsmart any possible creepers, and instead of camping out in our tents, we all slept in the beds of our trucks and SUVs. You know, because they can't possibly sniff a Toyota Tacoma, right? Anyway, it's the middle of the night, and I'm passed out in the back of my SUV when I suddenly feel a bright light on my face. Naturally, I would have woken up, cussed, and asked who was doing that. However, I instantly knew to pretend to be asleep and not let the individual know I was awake. I lay there next to my girlfriend hoping she would do the same as me, and I kept an ear out for any unusual sounds, like sniffing. All I could hear was a friend snoring by the campfire. After the light left my car, I heard the person walk to the next truck and shine his light on my friends in there. I slowly looked up and it ended up being some older guy just standing there staring at everyone while they slept. I waited until he left the campsite and I busted my behind out of that truck and woke up my friends, most of whom had been pretending to sleep and realized what was going on. An intruder can do more damage while camping than an animal. If you think these two strangers were acting weird, you'd be more creeped out by the dude in story number 7. Story 5. I was out walking around the bush, hunting for upland birds. I walked through a bit of a valley as a shortcut to get to another area when I came across a guy standing on the trail with an AR-15 in the ready position. Instantly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up instinctively, knowing this wasn't a place I wanted to be, trying my best to stay calm. Hey, just out bird hunting. How are you doing? Fine. Long pause. I'm hunting deer. Deer season wasn't even open. AR-15s are not legal for deer, and he wasn't dressed for deer hunting. He looked homeless, hadn't changed his clothes or bathed or shaved in several days, and looked emancipated. Just think of the scariest 50-year-old ice you can think of, put an AR-15 in his hands, and you're probably close. Hey, so do you know the best way for me to go find some birds? Well, I imagine you might find some back the way you came. His voice got noticeably sharper with the back the way you came part, and I took the hint. I don't know if there was an ice lab or just what down the trail, but I was certainly happy to leave. I reported the incident to the sheriff the next day, but I don't know that anything ever came out of it. Story 6. I used to go backpacking all the time in the mountains and have some good stories, but hands down, the scariest thing I've ever encountered is lightning. My first real experience was at Philmont in New Mexico. Great backpacking area, lots of fun if you're a scout. It's not so fun when it storms, though. My group was eating dinner one night when lightning struck a tree about 50 feet from us. It was unexpected, there were dark clouds, but the sun was still shining through. It just shredded the tree and all of us jumped. Dinner ended up in the dirt. We had a couple of other close experiences during those 2 weeks, but that was the closest. The second and most terrifying experience was when we were in Kings Canyon, California doing the Ray Lakes Trail. One of the campsites was by a river. Now it's prone to rain in the Sierra Nevada, and we were at the bottom of a tight granite valley that showed some signs of historical flooding. It was not my ideal choice of a spot to sleep, but it was an NPS site, and that was the end of our day. At about 2 a.m., I was awoken by a flash of light so bright that I swear I could see the tent through my eyelids. Before I could even blink, the thunder roared so loudly that I thought the earth was tearing itself apart. It's hard to accurately describe the sheer power and sound that comes from being right next to a lightning strike. The night didn't end there either. We were directly under the storm, and the lightning just kept coming. The thunder never ceased to roll, and the rain was torrential. The lightning was so constant as well that you could almost see through the walls of the tent into the forest around us. It was light daylight out there, and I thought I was going to perish that night, either from a lightning strike or a flood if the river rose. Now, my third experience was in Switzerland. We were up in the Alps and got caught in an open but rocky area during a descent as a storm rolled in. Again, lightning strikes far too close for comfort, and there was no place to shelter. Just squatting down and praying we wouldn't get struck. Amazing trip, but that moment was not enjoyable. I love watching lightning and rain from inside a cabin or a covered porch, but if I'm outside and a storm is coming, I've almost got an animalistic fear that screams at me to get indoors. Lightning scares the living hell out of me if I'm not covered. Story 7. I was camping in a valley by myself with no cell service. I stayed late on a trail and ran into a nice local dude as it was getting dark. He showed me a local camping spot close to the road and the river, but camouflaged it. I had a fire, drank beer, and listened to my friend's comedy podcast. I was loud and visible, and because it was already dark, I decided to sleep in the back of my truck under my topper next to all of my gear as opposed to setting up my tent. The next morning, I made a fire, cracked another beer, and started making breakfast. Then I noticed that there was a man at the edge of my camp. He comes closer but never looks directly at me. This dude looks homeless, has a long, ratty beard, and has at least 100 plastic grocery bags tied all over his clothes. I comment about how nice the day is. There's no response from him. I offer him breakfast, and he still doesn't respond. He sort of paces around the perimeter of my camp. I offer him a beer, but he just turns around. So the dude is just standing there, back to me, wandering around. I'm realizing that there aren't going to be any good happenings here. I had my bear spray and buck knife super close, so I give him an ultimatum. Mofo, you're either going to acknowledge me or leave immediately. He ignores me. I grab the bear mace and walk a few steps toward him. He sulked away, and I threw my stuff in my truck and left that place right away. I wonder if he watched me during the night, and I thank my laziness for staying in my truck instead of a tent. Story 8. I went camping in Guinea Springs, Florida about 10 years ago, and sometime at night I heard that sound you hear in movies or TV of a huge tree falling. I didn't think anything of it. And then about 10 minutes later, I started hearing lots of people talking outside of my tent, so I got out and discovered the tree fell on someone's tent kind of close by and ended them. A helicopter had to come and airlift them out. Now, I've never had a fear of falling trees while camping until I heard this story. If you want to watch more videos about crazy, mad camping experiences, smash that like button and subscribe to my channel. Story 9. Safari guide here. I woke up one morning with something very warm, rather soft and comfy on my back. I realized my back was against the canvas of the tent. I realized also it was an animal. It was a really cold winter night. Temperatures dropped close to zero here in the Lowveld. What the f? As I moved a bit, I heard the voice of my buddy from his tent. He spoke a bit hushed and with a definite treble in his voice. The Africa bug, are you awake? Stupid me replied with a strong voice, yes. The animal next to me got up and luckily ran away. It actually turned out to be a big male lion. Story 10. My siblings and I went camping once and had a wild experience. An incredibly powerful storm came through and the lightning was just slamming the lake and crawling endlessly through the clouds while an endless roar went on and on and on. The winds and roar got so intense that we considered abandoning the tent for the car, considering the tent was lifting off of the ground anyway. We ended up running to the car, climbing in and proceeding to watch our tent collapse and be blown into a nearby tree. The car was shaking, so we decided to get out of there and drive for about 20 minutes to my grandpa's house to spend the night. The next day we went back and part of the campground was closed because a small tornado had gone through the campground the night before and trees were blocking some of the roads. Whether it was during or after our adventure, we've no idea, but from what we could tell, it was pretty close to where we were. We cleaned up our campsite and then left, and I've never witnessed a storm so powerful and frightening before. I also never found my sleeping bag. Story 11. This is my parents' story, not mine. They were on a canoe trip way up in nowhere, Saskatchewan, far from any semblance of civilization. And one morning they heard a rustling outside their tent. Still half asleep, my dad sat up and tried to figure out what was going on. The noise was loud and very close. Before he could collect himself enough to investigate, the whole side of the tent collapsed on top of him. The weight lifted quickly. Now entirely awake, my parents scrambled to open the tent flap and figure out what was going on. About 10 feet away was a spooked black bear staring confusedly and concerningly at the tent. After being yelled at a bit, it finally ran off. We figured it had been foraging in the bushes right behind the tent and lost its balance. So my dad can truthfully say he has been sat on by a bear. Now I know black bears aren't too dangerous, but man, they must be pretty heavy. Story 12. We like to hike 3 to 5 miles down a trailhead in deep Georgia. And one night, the temperature dropped into the low 20s, which is rare for mid-fall. We got a solid fire going, and the heat mixed with a full belly put us all to sleep. I woke up to my buddy tapping my foot with a stick. I looked up at him, and he nodded toward the fire. There were 2 wild boars kicking up dirt around the dying fire. We didn't have any sort of weaponry except a hand axe that was out of our reach. My friend and I lay there, completely silent, watching these 2 for about half an hour or an hour until the fire died completely down and they moved on. Now, if you don't know, wild boars in Georgia are easily 150 pounds, irritated all the time, and prone to literally anything. We were really lucky we didn't spook them. Story 13. My family went camping every summer when I was growing up. We usually bounced between Virginia Beach, Assateague, and this god-awful place called Westmoreland. One trip, we were in Assateague near the beach, and we had 2 tents set up in different parts of the site. Sometime in the middle of the night, my mom woke up, which woke me. She was sitting up straight but completely still, and I looked over at what she was staring at. In the moonlight, there was this silhouette of what looked like an old woman looking into our tent, long, wiry hair and everything. I was young, so it terrified the crap out of me, and I started asking my mom what that was, who was outside. Once I made a noise, it spooked the old woman, and she took off. That's when we realized she was one of the feral ponies that live on the island. We had set up that particular tent on one of their trails, and they were going down to the beach. Story 14. So I was in the Boy Scouts, and one of the merit badges I was working on was wilderness survival. I was at our week-long campout, and part of that merit badge requirement was to make your makeshift shelter and sleep a couple of miles away from the base campsite. There were about 8 of us boys, I would say, and the adult leader would leave us there to sleep for the night. Well, I am already a pretty anxious person, and the days leading up to this had me a bit tense already. So of course, halfway through the night, I suddenly heard from the other shelter, "No, please, get away, stop, don't." Then silence. Next, I whisper shout, "Hey!" and no response. It didn't even wake up anybody else. I quickly came to the conclusion that he was just sleeping, talking, and having a bit of a night terror. But to this day, I still can't believe it didn't wake anybody else up and that I was the only one to witness that, thinking we were all about to be slain. Story 15. We camped at the bottom of a valley with pretty steep rocky walls on either side on a backpacking trip in the Sawtooths, Idaho. In the middle of the night, we were all woken up by the sound of a rock slide, something that happens often in a place like that, I'm sure. Not like a whole mountainside giving way or anything, but at least a few large boulders tumbling down. We could hear them getting closer and closer, smashing through large trees and destroying everything in their path. I thought about running out of my tent, but it was pitch black out, and even if I had a clear view of the rocks, I wouldn't be able to see them or where they were going. I decided there were no other options with any better odds than just staying in my tent and hoping I picked a lucky spot. We couldn't find any signs in the morning, and the rocks might not have gotten any closer than a quarter mile for all I know, but that feeling of helplessness was pretty disturbing. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you're also going to enjoy Waiters. What seriously f***ed up things have you overheard? Story 4 is so wild. I'll see you in that video, and thank you for watching this one.